I feel I'm letting people down if I don't always help others when they ask. Katie was a bright-faced college student who just finished up her third year of an education degree and was on her way to hopefully becoming a school teacher. She called in for an appointment at the counseling center due to feeling anxious and stressed. She immediately impressed her assigned counselor as someone with a high level of energy and social awareness, and who openly described herself as having a big heart, and framed this personal value with the qualifying statement that, "I feel like I'm letting people down when I don't help others out when they ask." As the sessions proceeded, it was apparent that Katie was feeling overwhelmed with the demands of being a full-time student while holding a part-time job, combined with a general approach to relationships that required her to meet other people's requests for favors and help. She reported being particularly worn down by her overfunctioning in required group projects in her classes, as she performed a greater share of the work than other members, who either pled ignorance or lack of technological skill, or just approach the projects with passive attitude that gives Katie the idea they will not complete their share. This seemed to be a template for almost all of Katie's relationships. All too frequently she did things for others, whether it be a long-term boyfriend, her younger sister, or just friends of her childhood, more than they felt compelled to do for her. This contributed to a general sense underneath that she was not important to others as they were to her. When this inequity was pointed out, Katie reverted to her belief that she should always help others when they ask, if she is going to remain a good person and a good Christian. To be sure, we have all experienced friends, acquaintances, and even complete strangers who have made requests of us with varying degrees of emotional pressure and appeals for needed or desired help. We feel that pull to comply with whatever it is that they have asked for. Depending on how insistent that person is and how desperate their stated need is, it can almost feel like a giant magnet pulling us into their world emotionally. And this pull is a hard one to resist. It's hard to say no in the face of an emotional appeal, not only because of the sales pitch as to why they need help in the first place, but also because it is a sometimes subtle and other times very clear and open appeal to our own goodness to come to the aid of someone else in need. Anyone reading this who has ever had small children can understand how powerful the emotional pull can be on us to do a favor, and how easily you can get completely sucked into just going along with whatever they want, just to avoid the necessary energy it would take to hold your ground and not be swept up in their emotional tornado of need. Other times it is an implied and much more adult version of this appeal that is more cognitive and comes across as, well, if you care about me, then you'll help me with what I need. Or, if you don't help me out, then we both will know you're selfish. Whatever the nature of the request was, or how impassioned it was delivered, it is always hard at the core to resist any request others make of us, with the implied statements about our character and humanity, if we resist a completely reasonable call for help. This is even stronger if it is someone with whom we have a strong and personal relationship with, and we don't want to damage or don't want to offend. Other times, however, we are driven to offer help in situations that we are not specifically asked to give. We may see that someone is in need of help because of some glaring deficit in their life that is hard to overlook. Or we perceive that they simply aren't aware or capable of performing something needed for their own welfare. In Katie's example from her therapy session, she felt that some of her fellow students with whom she had been grouped with for projects were less talented or less capable than she was with technology, or perhaps struggled with the core concepts of the assignment. As a result, she felt she both had an obligation to fill in where her group mates either could not do or did not seem motivated to do, because it was always the right thing to do to help others. She also recognized that their lack of ability or motivation would negatively affect her grade if she did not if she did not increase her own investment. Either way, she felt that subtle call to give more of herself to others who gave less of themselves. And this is something that weighed on her over time, as it was just one more responsibility added to an already quite long list. If we accept the premise that all requests for help are exactly the same in nature and are all reasonably and good at face value, then how could you, in good conscience, refuse anyone who waved the white handkerchief? That is the central question at the heart of this statement about you should always help people, and one that we need to explore. Is everyone that asks you for help doing so out of an honest and pressing need? Are they approaching you from a sense of independence, where they have already exhausted their own resources, skills, and energy before asking for someone else to give over their precious and limited resources? Finally, is this thing they are asking for something that is morally good in and of itself, or something that will actually make their life better if you do this thing for them, or benefit their core character? The question is really whether all help really accomplishes any positive goal. As a friend of mine once asked, does it feel good, or does it do good? This seems to be the core question at hand. The other and less discussed issue that lies underneath the concept of help is how we individually see human nature. If you believe, as Katie presented, as someone that believed that everyone is basically a good person with pure motives and has values of independent self-care and would never ask someone to take care of them in the name of dependency, most folks, if pressed, would not pair the statement that heads this chapter with an idealistic view of human personality and just aren't thinking about this question at the same time. They are confronted with the generic concept of help, but if we force those two concepts to face off with each other, I find that few people will cling to an idealized view of people's behavioral core, instead of admitting that not everyone is asking for favors, time, or money for good reasons, or only asking after they have been responsible as they humanly could have been. My view of human nature is based on our roots as children. As I find myself saying to parents in session after session, children are consumers. That's who they are and what they do. By my experience, they don't just naturally evolve out of this constant childish neediness into some adult view of moderating one's own appetites and not wanting to take advantage of others out of some innate desire to make someone else play parent so they can continue living in the role of a consuming child. So then the question becomes whether someone is asking for your assistance because they want to be dependent and make you responsible for their needs and care. The next and obvious question is, are you contributing to the consumerism by giving this person what they are asking for? I recently heard a usually reliable and sensible pastor state in a sermon that he blindly gave a fairly large sum of money to a couple holding up a sign at a Walmart parking lot, stating that they were hungry and needed money for food, and that we were called not to judge or worry about what they do with the money, but only to respond with love and care. Frankly, this is a ridiculous stance to take on so many levels that it's offensive, and probably a sign that I need to send him a copy of this book, or at least this chapter. I've done enough time in social services to make an educated guess that the pastor's money went into buying some sort of illegal substance that would have been adjusted one way or another, paying off a gambling debt, or allowing the couple to avoid working honestly for a living. I've seen too many examples of this sort of behavior. There was a couple who panhandled regularly near my old office when I lived in Indianapolis, out by our main thoroughfare. This couple was well known by several of my clients who were police officers to be heroin addicts who collected a couple $100 a day to maintain their habit. Granting that there are quite a few people looking to feed destructive habits or irresponsible behaviors and lifestyles who hold these signs, don't we have an obligation to not contribute to the delinquency and destruction of someone else's character and personality, as well as their physical and emotional health. This seems like a foundational, if not admittedly a complicated issue, that we need to confront instead of blindly feeling all help is needed and good to give. The issue of personal stewardship is an important one that I speak about frequently with my clients, and it is certainly appropriate to discuss here in this chapter. We all have a limited amount of emotional and physical assets at our disposal, and a limited amount that we can create over the course of a day, a week, a month, or over the course of our life. There is also a hierarchy of responsibility at work here. Your first responsibility, I would argue, is to your own personal health, emotional growth, well-being, and cognitive development. This is easily justified from both a spiritual and therapeutic perspective, in my opinion. I would argue that the core spiritual value in Christian faith is the transformation of your being by the Holy Spirit by moving away from an animal instinct and reactionary gratification into becoming an existential being capable of the empathy, morality, and vision of Christ. From a purely secular therapeutic position, I would argue that the goal of therapy is to become healthier and more whole, both emotionally and cognitively, and to be able to relate to others better and make wiser and more self-protective decisions. Accepting these as true, there is a central need to protect your own resources in order to be able to appropriately function and grow. This is not a mandate for selfishness, but rather an understanding that a person is not unlike a car. In the basic maintenance, it is necessary, or you'll eventually be going nowhere and no one else will be getting a ride from you either. If you exhaust and deplete yourself, then you wouldn't have anything left to give anyone else anyway. You are responsible for the management and the dispensing of your own resources, and this means you have an ongoing duty to use and spend them in a way that benefits not only yourself, but also benefits your spouse, children, relatives, friends, employees, supervisors, and coworkers. I will personally admit that the process I just ran through above has left me in a position, despite being ironically in a helping position, where I am very careful about where I offer one-sided help to others and how much I allow myself to invest and give. One of the things I would address with Katie is the reality that the adult world and our whole system of being both legalistic and economically driven is based on the concept of quid pro quo. Without delving into the Latin roots and definition of the term, and understanding that I speak about this in other chapters, let's simplify it to mean that healthy adult relationships, either interpersonally or economically by necessity, should be fair and balanced, with each participant receiving something from one another of comparable value. People sometimes want to argue this with me from an idealist position. However, they invariably end up agreeing that they would object if their employer cut their wages, yet still expected the same amount of production. Similarly, they would also agree that they would have severe marital problems if their spouse stopped reciprocating altogether, but still expected the same level of favors, care, and attention. The challenge I would have for Katie is whether she really believed helping those slower, lazier fellow students in her group projects helped to prepare them to be fellow teachers in her profession, that she would want to continue to collaborate with, and has furthered their adult independence and responsibility as students, or did it actually damage them educationally and professionally? Did she actually cheat the whole college process by having allowed them to get a better grade than their effort, work, and skill actually deserved? Did she set them and their future employers up for a failure as a result? Was this a good expenditure of her own resources at school? in that she, on her own, spent her own energy worrying about someone else's grades and successes to the detriment of her own education that she was, in fact, paying for. My belief has come to be that it is my responsibility to teach my own children to eventually and appropriately grow from consumers to becoming self-sufficient adults who will eventually create their own resources and regulate their own behaviors while learning to care and protect themselves. Likewise, when I can Likewise, when I consider the subject of help, it is usually not a simple question. My goal would always be whether what I am asked to do furthers the requesting person's transition into being a more capable adult who can work, problem solve, and control themselves and their resources better, or will it allow them to retreat into a destructive, childlike position of dependence? I can certainly understand Katie's and others' dilemma and reluctance to jump into this deep set of considerations about what it truly means to help another human being fruitfully, and what effect it would have on ourselves, as it is a complicated and multifaceted question. Furthermore, it is a question that never has a paint-by-numbers set of answers that can always be applied in any situation, as each time the question is confronted, it requires an improvisational answer. This is probably why people would, in general, like to stay with the simple view of the issue and just endure the stress and frustration of believing and acting the same way Katie originally did. Reducing Katie's emotional exhaustion went hand in hand with reducing her accompanying anxiety and depressive symptoms, and required changing her view of relationships from a simplistic of absolute obligation based on fulfilling requests and demands. By instigating the essential question of whether a specific act feels good or actually does good in consideration when she was asked for help, Katie began to question whether spending her precious energy on a specific situation is a good investment rather than just being an automatic giving machine. Over time, her confidence began to rise in managing these requests, and she felt less altruistic about rushing to other people's aid and started to place a higher value on her own time, energy, and emotional capital. With this increased assertiveness, Katie also experienced a reduction in anxiety and has now become more intentional about these situations and people she does make an attempt to help, and feels much better about the higher percentages of success she experiences from her efforts as a result. She effectively changed what she told herself from, "I should help everyone that asks, and I feel guilty when I don't," to, "I will help those who truly cannot do it for themselves, and when it makes their lives better, and whom will appreciate it." Her relationships become much less one-sided and healthier as a result. Katie left therapy as a more confident, assertive young woman who was able to manage her emotional resources better and was capable of keeping from being overrun with the demands of others.